This video is not intended to be a step-by-step guide on how to rebuild your engine, but rather some information of the major steps you're going to go through if you're considering a rebuild. It all begins with your checked and or line board case. The aluminum 2-liter, 3-liter, and 3.2-liter cases make excellent rebuild candidates. If you have a 2.2, a 2.4, or a 2.7-liter case, there are a few modifications that you will certainly want to do to the case in order to make it stronger. Most important is the addition of time certs in the cylinder head stud mounting holes. This will decrease the likelihood that the studs will pull out of the relatively soft magnesium. You also want to make sure that all three mounting surfaces for the cylinders are flat and level. The magnesium cases have a tendency to warp over time, and rebuilding the motor without machining the case will most likely result in an oil leak. It's also wise to reinforce one of the center engine studs that has a tendency to pull out from the case. Assemble the rods and the crank away from the case. It is a good idea to mount the crank to the flywheel and use it as a stable base for tightening up the rods. Use plenty of assembly lube here. The rod nuts and bolts should always only be used once. They are designed to stretch and deform when torqued up to their final specifications. Make sure that the two rod halves match each other. The numbers stamped on both sides should always be kept together. The crankshaft, intermediate shaft, and oil pump are all shown installed in this photo. Use a new bend-up lock tab when installing the oil pump. Make sure that you properly install the timing chains before you go too far in this process. Even if you forget to install the chains, you can always install a master link chain later on. The master link chain allows you to disconnect the chain and remove it from the intermediate shaft without reopening the case. Everything that is a moving bearing surface should be coated with assembly lube. No need to be shy about spreading it on here. Make sure that you don't get the assembly lube on the case mating surfaces though. Don't forget the two thick O-rings on the oil pump and the one that seals the lower oil passages within the case. The two case halves are together and the new head studs are installed in this image. The consensus of the Porsche experts is that the Delavar studs are to be avoided and original style steel head studs should be used instead. Make sure that all the studs are identical in length, between 133 and 134 millimeters, and use some red Loctite when installing them. Remember when installing the through bolts on the case to insert the small O-ring that stop oil leaks. When you're installing the rings, make sure that you stagger the gaps on the rings and also be very careful that you don't break one. If you do, the entire top end of the engine will need to be removed and the engine will need to be re-ringed. If you're in doubt, pull a cylinder out and check after you have installed it. A tricky process is the actual installation of the piston cylinder assembly onto the rods. Some builders prefer to install the pistons and then place the cylinders over the pistons while the engine is on the stand. While this is easier, it's also much easier to break a ring this way. The cylinders must be installed in a particular order or you will not be able to slide in the wrist pin for the last one. Make extra sure that you don't drop anything as small as a wrist pin or snap rings down into the engine while you are installing the pistons. Here the cylinders are installed and the air guide sheet metal is ready to be installed. Make sure that the long fins on the pistons are installed on the exhaust side, or your pistons will overheat and seize. Also make sure that you install the sheet metal in the proper orientation. A seemingly minor mistake on the sheet metal can translate into serious heat problems for the motor later on. Bolt the heads to the cam tower before attaching them to the engine block. This avoids any alignment problems that may be caused by the case not being completely flat on the piston mounting surfaces. Liberally coat the mating surfaces of the cam tower with Loctite 571 case sealer while using an acid brush. Use new seals and oil return tubes. Make sure that you wet the seals with a little bit of motor oil before you install them. Immediately after bolting the heads to the cam tower, bolt the cam tower and heads assembly to the motor. tightening down the head studs in the proper torque value and sequence. You want to make sure that you have the entire assembly torqued down before the sealant cures. This image shows a dry test run fit of the heads and cam towers that was made prior to installation of the air guide sheet metal. It's a wise idea to make sure you have all your fasteners, washers, and sealants lined up before you assemble the cam towers and heads. When attaching the valve train, don't over-tighten the rocker arm shafts as they tend to leak if stretched a bit too much. On the older 911 engines, the rocker arms sometimes have a tendency to leak despite the design of this compression fitting. The solution is to install a small seal on the groove on the rocker arm prior to installing it in the cam tower. For more information on that, please follow the link provided at the end of this video. A very important step in the rebuild process is the setting of the cam timing. This is measured by using a dial indicator gauge that is mounted to the top of the valve. When the valve lift reaches a certain height, the engine must be at top dead center. The procedure calls for the adjustment of the cams until the valve lift reaches its required specification. With the timing set, the cam nuts can be tightened. Installing the cam tensioners is a snap when you have clear access to the front of the motor. Here is the completed long block looking shiny and new. The majority of the work is done, but to do the job right, there is still a lot of work to be performed on the fuel injection. Hoses, clamps, and seals should be replaced where necessary, and all parts should be cleaned as well as possible. Sandblasting or bead blasting your intake manifolds really adds to the finishing touches to the fuel injection. It's also a wise idea to use new screws and washers for attaching the engine shroud to the block. Carefully reassemble the fuel injection according to notes and pictures when you removed it. We hope this informational video helps you decide whether or not you can take on rebuilding the engine by yourself. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and check out another video in this series.